Formula One is all about creativity and innovation, which results in the major design and aero upgrades we get to see implemented weekly. But unfortunately, not all these upgrades are used in a way that the rule makers have intended them to. And this has caused problems on the track, making it harder to follow and overtake again. The solution? New regulation changes again. Get ready, a lot is going to change in the upcoming years. So the FIA intends to propose regulation changes in 2025 to enhance Formula One cars' ability to follow closely. And while the technical regulations would remain fundamentally unchanged due to the major overhaul coming in 2026 around the new F1 power units, when cars are expected to be a little smaller and lighter and run more adjustable aero, which we'll get into later. The changes for 25 would be specifically to tweak the weight characteristics of the cars by focusing on areas that have been found to be particularly problematic under the current rules. In an interview with the FIA's single-seater director Nicolas Tombazis announced the aim for rule modifications in 2025. He agreed that driver concerns that it has gotten increasingly harder to follow as cars evolved are correct, and that, although improvements for 2024 are not possible, since design work on the new cars is already far advanced, adjustments would be implemented for the following year. This backs up statements made by Carlos Sainz during the Italian Grand Prix, in which he stated that the cars were becoming more difficult to race. It's starting to become a bit like 2021 or 2020, where it was difficult to follow, said the Spaniard. According to the FIA's examination of the present ground effect machinery's performance, the 2023 cars have given up 50% of the improvements made in 2022 in terms of the downforce loss that cars incur when running close behind another, which makes them come awfully close to loss of load with the previous generation of cars. If we take the 2021 F1 cars, based on being 2 lengths from the car in front, they were losing more than 50% of the aero load, he explained. With the 2022 single-seaters, there was only a 20% reduction in load, but now we're at about 35%. Surely there has been a worsening, and on this point, Carlos is right. We have identified what we should act on. With teams already committing significant resources to next year's cars, it seems unjust for the FIA to try to force adjustments for 2024, especially as such efforts would be mostly useless due to the competitor resistance. Tombazis, on the other hand, claims that a viable solution will be developed on in plenty of time for 2025 to assist solve issues and enhance aero characteristics. We are studying solutions for 2025, he explained. We have identified some parts of the cars to act on, such as the end plate of the front wing, the side of the floor, and the fins inside the wheels around the brake ducts. We could lay down somewhat more restrictive rules in these areas. It is clear we no longer have the advantage of 2022, and therefore, we know that there is work to be done. Given that Tombazis indicated a 15% deterioration of the problem from the start of the current rule cycles, this highlights how tough it is for F1 rulemakers to come up with cars that effectively follow closely. Anything going through the air will cause some form of turbulence, and unless you race in a vacuum, this will always be the case. The reduced ability of cars to follow each other is the consequence of teams working hard to produce designs that maximize outwash, forcing airflow away from the car and tires. This outwash effect makes it difficult for cars to follow each other closely because the air that provides downforce is pushed clear. The front wing is one area where teams have been working to maximize the outwash effect, with Ferrari leading the way in utilizing a regulation modification to use slot gap separators that deflect airflow away from the car. Tombazis stated that there were features of current car advances that were detrimental to racing, but that the FIA could not intervene. We have the right to act on flexible bodywork when we see something that does not convince us because the regulation says that parts should be rigidly secured and immobile, he said. In reality, we know that this is not strictly possible, so there is a right to apply common sense. The regulations do not allow us to act on things we do not like on the cars. There are several aspects in the interpretation of the aerodynamic regulations that we do not like at the moment, but to change something, we would need to go through the procedures to achieve a broad consensus. Sometimes we have tried to change things, but we've not always achieved the result we wanted. I believe that 90% of the regulations are in line with what we wanted, and there is 10% that, with hindsight, we would have done in a different way. This is part of the tug of war between rulemakers and teams. The teams are simply concerned with performance, and given that there are 10 of them with resources that overwhelm those who create the rules, this slide from what the rules initially prescribe to what teams manage to deliver will always occur. That has been shown since the introduction of ground effect cars, as teams have developed ways to restore troublesome aerodynamic outwash that is terrible for a car following, but beneficial for performance. It's critical to temper expectations for what could be attainable in 2025. These will most likely be minor, but well-researched detail modifications, since they are driven by real-world data obtained by the FIA since the beginning of 2022. Small geometric adjustments and maybe more restrictive structural requirements will most likely clip the designer's biggest tricks. In that way, it appears comparable to the changes made in 2019. The most notable improvements were to the front wings, which were streamlined to reduce outwash. This was based on studies for the ground effect guidelines, which were set to be implemented in 2021. The 2019 adjustment was questioned for not making much of a difference, but the agreement was that it controlled the problem and prevented it from worsening dramatically in the last years under those restrictions. The aim is that the 2025 changes will be more successful, but the changes Tom Bazis has mentioned will not reinvent the wheel. The teams might perhaps assist as well, although via their own drive for success. The Red Bull, which looks to be less reliant on top-body downforce than its competitors due to mastery of ground effect flawed design, follows other cars with reasonable ease. With competitors fighting to follow in its footsteps, this may be a beneficial trend. However, history predicts that the 35% downforce loss rate will rise over the following year and a half. Finally, this is an issue that will not go away. Tom Bazis' figures are still an improvement over 2021, and changes in 25 are a wise intermediate action, at a time when it would be simple to shrug and do nothing while waiting for 26. Ground effect has long been touted as a solution for the problem of following, and it is true that moving to it has been a positive step. And as Tom Bazis has stated, short of returning to pre-wing days of the 1960s, the basic challenge that the FIA is attempting to address will never change. But in the end, these will be minor changes to make the last year of these regulations more interesting for the viewers. But when the sport's next major rule change takes effect in 2026, the FIA hopes to achieve bigger changes, including a 50-kilogram weight reduction with the F1 2026 cars. While the introduction of V6 hybrid power units, larger wheels, and new safety devices, like as the Halo, the weight of F1 cars has increased dramatically over the past decade. Drivers have complained that the feeling behind the wheel has changed for the worse as modern cars become lazier in slower corners. So the fix? F1 cars in 2026 will be smaller and lighter again. While the engine will be the major emphasis of the 2026 regulatory change, delivering greater hybrid power and running on entirely sustainable fuels, the chassis will also undergo considerable alterations, with technologies like active aerodynamic scheduled to come. Nicholas Tom Bazis feels a 50-kilogram weight reduction in 2026 is possible. Tom Bazis had a crucial impact on the formulation of F1's 2022 rule changes, which were enacted with the primary goal of making overtaking simpler. And he thinks that the next generation cars will be faster on straights but slower in corners, with a hybrid system contributing more to total lap time. He said, "With the dimensions of the wheels, which will be narrower, plus with the rear wing and the car in general, we aim to reduce the weight of the cars by around 50 kilograms. So it will be possible to see smaller single-seater cars, shorter and narrower, but we are talking about solutions that will need to be discussed. With the car on a diet, we will be able to reduce the cornering speeds a bit. Being lighter, they will go faster in a straight line, but will generate less aerodynamic load. So we will need to increase the hybrid's energy recovery to ensure adequate lap performance. A lot of work has been done to understand how energy recovery and management will have to be done, and how overtaking can be done based on the aerodynamic configuration. We've carried out many simulations by changing these parameters, and we've found solutions that seem to work adequately." Reigning world champion Max Verstappen expressed his displeasure with the 2026 rule changes ahead of the British Grand Prix, warning journalists that the revision risks steering F1 in the wrong way. Verstappen also voiced concern that the 2026 engines will push drivers into a counterintuitive driving style, needing downshifts even on the longest straights to charge the hybrid systems. Tom Bazis, a former McLaren and Ferrari engineer, believes that such a perspective is already out of date, emphasizing that the 2026 engine and chassis requirements must be evaluated. He said, "If one took the 2026 power units and mounted them on the current cars, probably the result would be the scenario put forward by those who were worried. But in recent months, we've collected a series of very positive developments, so the comments expressed our old positions. We also need to take into account that the engine and chassis will have to evolve together, and it will not be possible to think of one without the other." So, what are your thoughts? Has racing become dull again with the ground effect cars? And will they even be able to make enough regulation changes so that the teams won't find another loophole to increase the wake of the car? And what about those 2026 changes? Are you happy to see a lighter and smaller car again? Hopefully, this will provide us with more close battles and overtakes, but only time will tell. And knowing the FIA, the rules aren't set in stone, so all changes are possible.